going to be talking about minerals and grazing young cereals. It's a project that I've been doing with Andrew Thompson, who is here in the audience. You can answer some sticky questions if I get stuck. And it's, for the first year, was supported by AWI and MLA. So there's lots of information about grazing cereals, about why people do and advantages and other things. I can't go through that in the time I've got available here today. But some just basic principles are that the grazing cereals do have the potential to fill the winter feed gap, and because they're available about the same time as animals are during pregnancy, then they've got the potential to improve reproductive efficiency, and they have the potential to improve whole farm stocking rates. Part of what we're talking about here is there's been some industry concerns about relatively high ewe mortalities in animals grazing crops, and of course that leads to lamb mortality as well. The project really started around this bottom part here, and this is just one component, the minerals part of it, because there's really an absence of management guidelines for pregnant and lambing ewes grazing cereals, nothing like there is for pastures. So the first year of the project is what I'm essentially going to be talking about today, and most of this is desktop type stuff that was leading to hypotheses and identification of problems that we could use in the second and third year. So what happened was it was a compilation of information. We did a whole series of in-depth interviews with producers and consultants, about 20 producers and 20 consultants, and that was literally an hour or an hour plus on the telephone talking through with them what their issues were and how they used crops. We conducted a web survey quite late in the year, which was reasonably successful. We got a couple of hundred responses from people who had got experience with grazing crops. And the first part we actually did was a literature review, which meant going through all the information we could find on grazing crops in reproducing ewes or other sorts of sheep, and working out what we thought the issues were. Towards the end of the first year, AWI were keen on us to get more information on how big a risk this might be, and we obtained some crop analyses from some commercial plant analysis laboratories, CSBP in WA and Nutrient Advantage in Victoria, I think they are, which is an Incitec Pivot lab. They were really helpful in providing the information, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is this crop analysis, but particularly from the Incitec Pivot lab. The literature review is really the only general stuff I'm going to be talking about today, but it gives some really interesting information when you look at crops and their potential. So first of all, the high nutrient availability from grazing young crops coincides with reproducing ewes, which is really good. Young crops are highly digestible, something like 80% digestible, about 12 megajoules per kilogram, enough to support any sort of productive system. They've got high protein, usually over 20%, which is probably more than an animal actually requires, but there you go. The energy and protein content of these plants means that there is no limitation to intake. If you've got a low protein or low energy, then intake's usually depressed because the animal can't reach its potential. With these, then they should be able to reach their potential. Low food requirement for live weight gain. For pastures, you talk about 1,200 to 2 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. For crops, they seem to be able to put on weight at a very low food level, presumably because of the high vertical growth of these plants. Although we haven't defined it yet, you've had people grazing at around 500. One of the guys I worked with in CSIRO has been starting grazing at 100 kilograms per hectare. They grow very rapidly. There are possible non-nutritional benefits with if you get a reasonably high crop with shelter and feed near the birth site so that the ewe doesn't see the need to wander off. But there is this mineral imbalance or metabolic disease potential that came up within some of the interviews, and that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about today. So the rest of my slides are really going through mineral composition of plants and what the risks might be. Sorry? the one after this one. Is what I'm is what I'm going to do. So this was the survey with producers. By the next talk, I'll have it perfect. The survey with producers and consultants, depending on what region we were in, there was between. Thanks, Andrew. There was sort of between 10 and 90% of wool growers or sheep producers in the region that actually grazed crops. For most individuals, they graze somewhere between 0 and 100, usually depending on the year. Good season, they might graze nothing. It just depended, on what the need was. From this survey of the producers who grazed cereals, there was 18% of people we spoke to just said, we don't do it. We've lost too many animals in the past. We just don't graze reproducing ewes on cereal crops anymore. Of that 18%, 63% of them said that they actually had metabolic problems in the past. Of the 29% who still graze cereals in late pregnancy, 29% of those who still graze cereals in pregnancy had also had some metabolic problems. Okay, so now I'm just going to get onto the specifics of talking about the plants. Let's talk about sodium to start with. So these are just concentration bands, if you like. So this is 0 to 1, 1 to 2, as we go through this way. And up here is the percentage of samples that we obtained that were in any of these particular ranges. So the arrow there and the orange box indicates the sodium deficiency level. So about 65% of the wheat samples that were analysed, 23% of oats and 15% of barley were classically sodium deficient. Please ask questions as we're going along if that helps. When we looked at magnesium, magnesium requirements are about 0.12, so 26% of wheat, 31% of oats and 90% of barley were classically deficient in magnesium. So it means those particular crops are susceptible to hypomagnesemia, but hypomagnesemia is not simply a magnesium issue. And it involves certainly potassium, but probably also sodium. So with high potassium, low sodium in the diet, tends to be high potassium, low sodium in saliva as well. These all cause high potassium and low sodium in the rumen, and they just depress magnesium absorption. And they seriously depress magnesium absorption. They don't just slow it down. They can change something which is an adequate diet into a deficient diet. So you end up with less magnesium absorbed, lower blood magnesium, lower cerebrospinal fluid, and the classic signs of hypomagnesemia, which are irritability, muscle twitching, convulsions, staggering, and potentially death. And I guess reasonably importantly, this also means that you get low magnesium in urine, so that can be a diagnostic to see what's going on in the animal. Sorry?
So, did you test magnesium in the soil? Does that have any effect on the magnesium available in the crop when it's grown? Or?
Yeah. The question's about whether we tested magnesium in the soil. We didn't in this. This was opportunistic. It wasn't even part of the project to start with. So we've looked at sort of rainfall, and we can look at regional differences, but from the information we've got at the minute, we can't look at magnesium in the soil.
Do you think your business did make a difference?
I think it's probably more about the plant than the soil. And we had some discussion in the last session about pH of the soil, so it may well be more about soil properties, not just magnesium in the soil. But I can't answer your question directly, to be honest. Yeah. So given the importance of potassium, we also need to look at potassium in these plants. This level here of 3 is the maximum tolerable level out of the textbook. It doesn't mean it's toxic. What it means is it's the highest level where there hasn't been toxicity observed, measured. So below that you're okay, and above it you might be okay, but not too far above it. And essentially wheat, again, a very high proportion of wheat samples were above, 45% of oats and a high proportion of barley as well. So what this does is you can look at its susceptibility to hypomagnesemia as an index, and the index is the amount of calcium, divided by the amount of magnesium the amounts of potassium divided by the amount of magnesium. When you do this, you get this ratio. This high risk ratio of 2.2 is actually a cattle ratio. There hasn't been a lot of work done with sheep, so we're assuming that it's probably applicable to sheep as well, but that needs to be established. But it does mean that there's a very high proportion of wheat, nearly 80%, and oats and barley where the animals are susceptible to hypomagnesemia. So just a summary on this part. A high proportion of crops were low or deficient in sodium and magnesium, particularly sodium, really chronically, acutely deficient in sodium. A high proportion of the crops with potassium that was at almost toxic levels. The issue about the potassium at that level is that potassium can influence magnesium absorption at a much lower concentration than that. So this is being pretty conservative, to be honest. So there's potential sodium magnesium deficiency, possible hypomagnesemia, an unbalanced mineral intake. What the specific effects of very high potassium are, we don't really know, to be honest. There might be more issues. So I haven't mentioned calcium. So when you look at calcium, again, there's a reasonably high proportion. About half the oats and wheat, and a small amount of barley that are low in calcium, deficient in calcium. Calcium's a complicated story. Okay, so some crops are low in calcium, which may make them animals susceptible to hypocalcemia. They also tend to have a moderately high cation-anion balance, a DCAD, and that high DCAD also increases the susceptibility to hypocalcemia, mucks up vitamin D metabolism. Hypocalcemia, as you probably all know, is acute, comes on very quickly, so it's not something that comes on with a long calcium deficiency in the diet. Ewes are particularly susceptible, ewes impregnating and lactating ewes. And the bit we're struggling to come to grips with here at the minute is that certainly in dairy cows, calcium supplements may increase the risk of hypocalcemia. So it's very hard to say how we deal with this part. Probably deal with magnesium, sodium reasonably well with a salt magnesium oxide type supplement, but not quite sure how to handle the calcium supplements. So I'll quickly just run through why it is that the calcium supplements are a bit of a risk, I guess. When you give high calcium diets, you tend to drive this box up the top. So you don't need to worry about all the things that are in there. But this is the way the animal, which has got a super sophisticated way of maintaining calcium homeostasis. It's very hard to move blood calcium. So higher blood calcium, the thyroid gland produces calcitonin. Calcitonin stimulates deposition of calcium in the bone, reduces reabsorption of calcium back out of the kidneys, and blood calcium goes down very quickly. So when you're supplementing with animals with calcium, you are cranking up this pathway. The animal is saying, I've got lots of calcium here, it's coming in, stick it in the bone, send it out in the urine, get rid of it. So this is going. What happens when you suddenly get milk let down, or when an animal goes onto an extremely low calcium pasture or feed, is that you want this pathway to be going. So this pathway is really produces parathyroid, stimulates reabsorption of calcium, most importantly stimulates release of calcium out of the bones, because the animal they have massive amounts of calcium, so it's not a matter of not having enough calcium, it's a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Increases calcium absorption, and blood calcium goes down. So the issue with hypocalcemia is going from here to here, or at least this not being able to cope with a sudden huge demand in calcium that you get from things like milk letdown. So what they're finding with dairy cattle at least is if you give lots of calcium supplements and you've got this one going, it's even harder to get back to here. So you may make it a little bit worse.
I understand those processes, but I still don't get 100% why continuing to provide a calcium supplement through lactation or early lactation is going to increase the problem.
Purely because it can't change from here to here. in a couple of hours. So when you get something like a sudden drain of calcium from the body, you know, it's acute. It happens over a few hours. The animal doesn't have the capacity to change to this pathway in that short period of time. If it's a dietary transition, then it will, if it happens over days or weeks. But when you just suddenly have that drain, and particularly milk letdown's what causes it, you know, in dairy cattle, all of a sudden you're producing milk, and it's kilograms a day, and that's a massive calcium drain on the body. So where to with this project? I mean, supplements, I got pulled up in the last talk about supplements not really being expensive, but you know, they're messy and you don't really want to use them if you don't have to. They're inconvenient, they get wet. You've got to make sure animals are eating them. So, you know, preferably you only want to use them when they're required. So what we're doing this year is we're trying to develop a risk matrix to work out when animals are actually at risk and when they're susceptible to some of these metabolic diseases. And we're trying to do that through looking at pasture in detail, or crops, non-crops in detail, and then measuring plasma minerals and urine minerals to try and establish what these interactions are doing to calcium and magnesium in the body, and then we'll relate that to flock information. Doing it across 15 farms and 15 different flocks of sheep, where we look at them when they go on and 3 weeks later after they've been grazing young cereal crops. And it's across a range of cereal crops and a range of places. So it's really an information collection exercise. So where to from here? Well, what we'd like to be able to do is to develop these supplements that are appropriate for managing the whole interaction. You know, it's not just a simple deficiency, it's an interaction, and that's the way it has to be dealt with. So it's an interaction of low sodium, low magnesium, and low calcium combined with high potassium. The obvious question is what to do now, and some things are self-evident, other things I can't give you definite answers on. So the way some people are dealing with it is they just don't graze young cereals with pregnant animals, which is, you know, not a very useful long-term solution, because it really can be a very good feed source. The alternative is to graze, monitor and treat as required with injections of calcium or magnesium, but again that's really time consuming and a bit difficult. Probably for magnesium and sodium, they can be provided reasonably easily as supplements. People use magnesium oxide or magnesium carbonate and salt, particularly for wheat. Benefits of calcium supplements, I can't really give you an answer to that at the minute. I wouldn't feel uncomfortable about using them if it was my animals. But you know, it's trial and error, but I hope within a couple of years when we finish this project, we'll have a much better idea of what's going on here. To change the DCAD, the anion balance, is you know, it's probably preferable to use chlorides and sulfates rather than oxides and carbonates for any supplements that get used, you know, whether it's magnesium or sodium, so obviously sodium carbonate. But again, that's trial and error. And you know, from what we look at, there's probably going to be more calcium problems with oats and more magnesium problems with wheat. But given that range, it's really impossible to say that you will or won't have a problem with any of those particular crops. So that's where I'd like to finish, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Questions about mineral blocks. To be honest, a lot of mineral blocks contain a lot of stuff that you don't need. So you can't, and I can't just say, well, they're good or they're bad. Really, all you need is, from what we know at the minute, is magnesium oxide and sodium chloride, or perhaps magnesium chloride and sodium chloride. If
what about the calcium?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I don't, at the minute, I can't tell you whether providing a calcium supplement would do more harm than good. That's the way it is.
Yep.
There's questions we had in the last talk about providing hay, and that, you know, it does seem to be reasonably effective for dairy cattle. I'm not quite sure what the theory is. Presumably it's changing the DCAD of the whole diet, and saliva is buffering some of the acidity problems. But you know, it's still a bit of an open question. The questions about whether animals know when to go and eat leeks or not. There's been, there's lots of conflicting results on that sort of stuff. There are people that believe there's some sort of nutritional wisdom that an animal knows when it needs something and goes and gets it. There's two examples using the same element that make you think that's not quite the case. One is salt, but an animal will eat salt even when it doesn't need it. It'll eat 20 times as much as it needs it, and usually if you have a salt leak, the animal will go and eat it. So that makes you think, well, they don't have nutritional wisdom for salt. The other side is if they get sodium deficient, an animal goes mad. It will eat, it will lick soil, it will find urine patches. So it has an incredibly strong drive to find sodium. But there's not a lot of evidence that for most minerals that an animal knows what it needs. And that's why people who sell blocks.
I've seen stop chewing bones when I believe they were calcium deficient.
Yeah, I thought chewing bones we're talking about, that chewing bones was more of a phosphorus issue than a calcium issue. Yeah.
It seemed to stop when we used more superphosphate.
Yeah.
Which I thought also had calcium in it, but I might be in the wrong thing.
No, it doesn't got a lot. It's mostly phosphorus.
So it might be
It's classic phosphorus. Yeah.
Question for you, Dave. Fibre. How do you see fibre as a role in preventing hypercalcemia?
Well, we were talking about this before the talk actually, and I'm not sure. I don't know what the mechanism would be for it preventing hypercalcemia, unless it's something to do with just reducing the DCAD in the whole diet, and perhaps saliva's coming through with a different pH. But I did look at it when I was doing the review, and I couldn't really find anything that I found convincing. But lots of people like you have provided me with information that says if you use fibre, it helps avoid hypercalcemia.
Andrew? Just if you got, I'm about to put 1,500 ewes on crops next week. I've already grazed some. A twin bearing and single. Just on that, just the information here, and I know I'm just going to go at it, but it showed that barley was probably least likely to have deficiencies, whereas wheat was high. Would you be better off putting it, I'm going to decide whether to put twin bearing ewes on the barley and put the singles on maybe on the wheat? What's your view on that?
Well, I guess my interpretation is the same as yours. The question's about whether using barley or wheat to graze with the lowest risk. So my interpretation is the same as you, that barley tends to be not as deficient. The work that Hugh Dove in Canberra has done with non-pregnant ewes tends to show responses to wheat, but not to barley when he gives magnesium and sodium supplements, which makes you think they're not such a problem. There are some that are really low, so you don't know. But I guess that would be my guess, and I'd probably use magnesium and salt supplements, and perhaps some fibre for calcium. Otherwise, I'm not sure.
David, you haven't mentioned roughage or hay supplements fed out with.
Yeah. Okay. Questions about roughage and hay. I've had this question every session as well, and I probably haven't handled it very well. I mean, there's the classic, the recommendations for dairy cattle, I think, are to feed hay. Now, whether that is just an improvement in DCAD, or whether in some way it changes composition of saliva or produces more saliva with more bicarbonate and more buffering capacity, I'm not sure, but I haven't really found anything that convinces me that it works. Certainly nothing published recently, but there are people that have been in these sessions that say it does improve it. So it's certainly not going to do any harm if you provide some fibre. Minimum, it's probably just going to change the dietary composition.
But it stops going straight through too. That's the other thing. It slows down the rate through the animal.
Yes, but how's that going to help? How's that going to help with the mineral issue?
I don't know, but it certainly stops it just firing out and virtually the liquid pouring out.
Okay. So you're just talking about non-mineral issues with diarrhoea and scouring. Yeah. Again, the argument is that these crops don't contain a lot of fibre. They actually do contain a lot of fibre. So in theory, giving fibre is not an advantage. There's been a little bit of experimentation with it which showed no advantage, but that was with non-pregnant animals. I've certainly talked to people that say using magnesium supplements has decreased the scouring that they've got when grazing crops, but less convincing information with grazing hay or straw.